Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about the study of ecology, and the study of ecology is the study of relationships in biology. So let's go ahead and get started. You should have your guided notes out with you. So go ahead and pull them out, and let's look at the first slide. Okay, so what is ecology actually? Ecology is the scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environment, focusing on on energy transfer. So we're looking at exactly what is being transferred. So does a consumer eat the producer? And how much energy is transferred from the producer? So the producer is going to get all the energy from the sun, and only 10% of that energy is going to transfer to the primary consumer, and only tenfold of that energy is going to transfer to the secondary consumer. So ecology is a science of relationships. Okay, so what do we mean by the environment? The environment is made up of two factors, biotic factors, bio meaning living. So biotic factors are all the living organisms inhabiting the earth. And abiotic, bio meaning living, but a meaning not. So abiotic would be all the non-living parts of the environment: temperature, soil, light, moisture, air, currents. Now just think, what else is there within the environment that is not living? There's probably some that you can come up with. Okay, so this is how we measure the environment. So first we have an organism. Think of maybe a bear. And then we have a population, so a bunch of bears together. And then that population lives within a community. So that bear lives in the forest, and there's birds, and there's insects, and there are rabbits, and there are trees, and there are many organisms that live in that community. So then we move up to ecosystem, and within an ecosystem there are many communities. So there might be forests and plains and other types of communities within one ecosystem. And then we move up to a biosphere. So the biosphere is the entire Earth. So we go down or we can go up. So what is an organism? Well, an organism is any unicellular or multicellular form exhibiting all of the characteristics of life or an individual. It's the lowest level of organization in ecology. So you are an organism, I am an organism, a fish is an organism, a banana is an organism. Anything is an organism. Anything living, that is. So what is a population? A population, like I said earlier, is a group of organisms. A group of organisms that are the same species, though. So we can't have a monkey and a starfish and a bee. That's not going to be a population. Population is going to be like a group of humans or a group of starfish or a school of fish. So a population is a group of organisms, one species living in the same place at the same time that interbreed. They produce fertile offspring. This is very important because if you think of a mule, they do not produce fertile offspring. So when a horse and a donkey produce a mule, when you try to mate two mules together, they will not reproduce. So this is not a population. They compete with each other for resources. Remember, our resources are food, mates, shelter, and water. Now, our community are several interacting populations that inhabit a common environment and are interdependent. So we have abiotic and biotic factors within this community, And we have several different populations. We have populations of insects. We have populations of bacteria. We have high-level consumers like our hawks. And we have low-level consumers like reptiles and rodents, our herbivores. Okay, then we move into the level of an ecosystem. An ecosystem are populations in a community and the abiotic factors with which they interact. So we have terrestrial and we have marine. Okay, and finally, we have the biosphere, the life-supporting portions of Earth composed of air, land, fresh water, and salt water, the highest level of organization within our planet. So now we move on to habitat and niche. So we talked about this in our project. A niche is the role a species plays within the community. It's its total way of life. Without a niche, we do not know exactly what the species does. So the habitat is the place in which an organism lives out its life. So the niche is the role, the habitat is where it lives. Okay, so a habitat versus niche again. A habitat is determined by the tolerance limitations of an organism or a limiting factor. There are many limiting factors, but a limiting factor is specifically any biotic or abiotic factor that restricts the existence of an organism in specific environments. So let's think about this. A limiting factor can be the amount of males versus females, so mates. It can be food. It can be shelter. It can be a lot of different things, but let's take a specific look. So an example of a limiting factor is going to be your amount of water, food, temperature. So if the temperature gets too cold or too hot, the amount of space. So remember, you've probably learned about carrying capacity and the availability of mates. There are three main types of our feeding relationships, and I'm sure you've heard of some of them. Producer and consumer. So we have our plants which produce all of our sugars, and they are consumed by our herbivores. Our herbivores then are consumed by our predator-prey relationships usually, and our predator-prey relationships are then again consumed by a secondary or tertiary consumer. Then we have a parasite and host. And a parasite and host is where the parasite benefits and the host is harmed. So you might think of like a termite and a tree. You might think of a leech and whatever it is attached to. So there are a couple of examples that you could use for those type of relationships. So feeding relationships, producers, all autotrophs or plants, they trap their energy from the sun. And remember, we do this by photosynthesis. Think about what the equation is for photosynthesis. You will need these for your OGTs. They are the bottom of our food chain. They are always the bottom of the food chain. And the sun is not included in our food chain, even though it provides the energy for our producers. Okay, our consumers. All are heterotrophs. They are ingestive food. They ingest food containing the sun's energy. We have herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and decomposers. Remember, our decomposers are not ingestive heterotrophs. They digest their food outside of their body, and then they ingest what they have digested outside of their body. They absorb all of the good nutrients. So our consumers. We have primary consumers, which eat solely plants. And then we have secondary and tertiary consumers, which they prey on animals, and they are usually carnivores, but they can be omnivores as well. Okay, so our consumers, carnivores, remember, they are our meat eaters. They are predators, which they hunt their prey and animals for food. We have consumers, which are carnivores as well and eat meat, but we also have scavengers, and they feed on carrion and dead animals. So your vultures would be a good example of this. Okay, then we have our omnivores, which eat both plants and animals. Okay, and remember, we just talked about decomposers. Our fungi are a good example of our decomposers. They break down the complex compounds of dead, decaying plants and animals into simpler molecules. Now remember, when we talked about fungi, what did we say that fungi grow good in? Do you remember? Well, they grow good in manure. So, think about what that is. Okay, symbiotic relationships. Symbiosis is two species living together. We have three types of symbiosis. We have commensalism, parasitism, and mutualism. I'll say that one more time in case you did not get that. We have three types of symbiosis. We have commensalism, parasitism, and mutualism. Okay, so commensalism is one species benefiting the other, and the other is neither harmed nor helped. So this is like an orchid on a tree. An orchid actually grows on a tree, and it doesn't hurt the tree, but the tree isn't helped either. It just is kind of there. So commensalism is one species benefits and the other is neither harmed nor hurt. And another example of this would be polar bears and cyanobacteria. So polar bears, they have cyanobacteria that grows on their backs, but it doesn't harm nor help them. And then parasitism, one species benefits, which is the parasite, and the other is harmed, which is the host. Usually we think of this in terms of like with lampreys and leeches, fleas and ticks. You probably look through your dog's hair for fleas and ticks, and heartworms would be another one. Mutualism is beneficial to both species, and an example of this would be cleaning birds and the cleaner shrimp. They both benefit. Another example of mutualism is a lichen. And a lichen, there are two species actually living together. It's going to be a cyanobacteria and a plant-like material. And they benefit each other, and they live on trees and tree bark. If you look at tree bark, you will see a lot of lichen. And here's an example. Here's a couple of examples of lichen. You can also see them on rocks, but it's more common to find them on plant materials. Now, here is a table that helps you to see whether or not species are being harmed or species are being benefited. As you can see, mutualism is the best type because both species are benefited. In parasitism, it's probably the one that is the worst because one of the species is harmed and only one is benefited. In commensalism, one species benefits but one is neutral. So if I had my pick, I would probably say I would want mutualism, but if I couldn't pick that, then I would pick commensalism. So we move on to trophic levels, and each level of the food chain is a trophic level. So as you move up a trophic level. So each link in the food chain we call a trophic level. Trophic levels represent a feeding step in the transfer of energy and matter in an ecosystem. So biomass. The amount of organic matter comprising the group of organisms in a habitat is known as biomass. As you move up the food chain, both available energy and biomass decrease. So by tenfold, like I said earlier, we're decreasing this. So you have 100% energy at the producer level. So the plants have 100% of energy from the sun. And we actually all get our energy from the sun because we're all taking that energy. But as we transfer it, we get less and less percentage of that energy from the sun. So by the time we eat a piece of meat, we're actually only probably getting 1% of that energy from the sun. And that's because we're decreasing it tenfold. So energy is transferred upward, but it's also diminished each time with each transfer. So if we look at this, producers or autotrophs have the most energy, and then primary consumers or herbivores have a little bit less, but they still have a pretty good amount. And then secondary consumers or small carnivores have a good amount. And then tertiary have the least. So if we look at this, like I was saying before, our tenfold, we decrease it, so we have 100% at our producers. Our first consumer then only gets 10% of that energy from the producer. So that's the amount of energy they're actually getting from the sun. And then our second consumer only gets 1% from the sun. So we're decreasing that by a big amount. So if we look here, we're just looking at a energy food web. So the food requirement of the tertiary consumer is going to be a lot more because we're decreasing tenfold than we're going to need for the primary or the secondary consumer. Okay, so with the trophic levels, if we look at a food chain, now notice this is a food chain and not a food web, so it goes in a straight line. A food web looks solely like a web. Now, the food chain is a simple model that shows how matter and energy move through an ecosystem. So we're looking at a food chain that starts in either the ocean or a river, and it goes up through the land because we're starting with algae and we're going through fish to raccoons. Now, look at this one. We're going to start with grass, and that is going to be our producer. So we know it's all on land.